The winter wind howled through the old pine trees, sweeping snow across the frozen ground like blades slicing through silence. Somewhere in the peaceful northern countryside of America, nestled deep in the quiet wild, stood an old cabin, tucked just off a snow-covered trail. Clara Whitmore pulled her wool scarf tighter as her boots sank deep into the snow. Beside her, 3 small children walked quietly. Eli, 10 years old, led the way with a steady face. Rosie, only 7, clung to her brother's arm, and Tommy, 5, gripped the hem of his mother's skirt, his mittens stiff with frost. They had been walking for 3 days, pushing through woods and gnawing hunger, clinging to the fading hope of finding shelter. Clara didn't know how much farther she could go, but she knew one thing: she couldn't stop, not with her children still shivering from cold and fear. Ahead, through the falling snow, a faint light flickered. A cabin. Clara sank to her knees in front of the heavy wooden door, her breath curling in white clouds against the frigid air. Her hand trembled as she raised it and knocked 3 times, the sound hollow and out of place in the snow-drenched forest. No answer. She knocked again, harder, almost pleading. Tommy clung to her leg while Rosie coughed, her lips tinged with purple. Then, the door creaked open. Graham Sinclair stood there, tall and still, his frame bathed in the glow of firelight behind him. A thick coat draped his shoulders, his beard dusted with gray, and his eyes deep. Not cold, but weary. He said nothing. He didn't need to. 3 soaked, pale children told him everything. He stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in." Clara didn't hesitate. She ushered the children inside, nearly lifting Tommy over the threshold. As the doors slammed shut behind them, the storm's howl vanished, swallowed by the wave of warmth inside. The cabin breathed like a living thing. Pine smoke, the crackle of flame, and a deep silence born from long solitude. Graham moved briskly, pulling chairs close to the hearth. "Sit, get warm." Clara obeyed, unwrapping scarves and peeling coats from her children. Eli rubbed Rosie's hands while Tommy burrowed into his mother's lap. Graham returned with a kettle and a few chipped mugs. "Drink. Ain't much, but better than the cold." Clara accepted the mug, her numbed fingers clutching the warmth. She stole a glance at Graham, a man who looked like he'd stopped expecting good things long ago, and yet didn't turn away when someone needed him. "You didn't have to help us," she whispered. Graham stared into the fire. "Didn't do it for you. Did it for the kids. They're cold." The next morning, the sky remained dull and gray, but the snow had stopped. The cabin was wrapped in the kind of stillness that belonged to places long acquainted with solitude. Clara woke upright, a borrowed wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She turned to look. The 3 children were still fast asleep near the hearth, cheeks flushed pink from warmth. She exhaled softly. Outside, the rhythmic sound of an axe echoed. Clara cracked the door and saw Graham splitting wood. Each strike sharp and clean. Snow dusted his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice. "You don't have to do all this for us," she said gently, her voice hoarse. "Not doing it for you," Graham replied, eyes never leaving the log. "Stove needs wood. It don't care who's hungry." Clara recognized the type, men who hid kindness behind rough hands and gruff words. She said nothing more, just stepped off the porch, picked up a few logs, and began to help. No need for more words. Over the next few days, the silence between them softened. Eli started helping Graham with outdoor chores, shoveling snow, fetching water, even learning to split wood. Graham showed him how to hold the axe, how to swing it properly, his instruction patient and precise. Rosie stayed indoors with Clara, helping patch mittens, sort vegetables, and whisper questions about Mr. Graham. And Tommy, the youngest, trailed after Graham the most. Despite the man's brusque nature, the boy never stopped talking. "What's that knife for? Are there bears? Can I get a horse someday?" Graham didn't brush him off. He answered every question, calmly and without fuss. That's for wood, not bears, and no horse. One afternoon, as Rosie played near the fire, Graham handed her a small carved figure. A bird, delicate and careful, its wings slightly spread. "For me?" Rosie asked, eyes wide. "Yeah, spring bird," Graham said. Tommy received a simple wooden whistle. He ran through the cabin, blowing it with wild delight, until Clara laughed aloud, a clear, genuine laugh that made Graham glance up, startled. It had been a long time since this cabin heard laughter. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the pine trees, casting soft golden streaks across the snowy ground. The cabin rested in quiet stillness. Clara stepped out onto the porch, having just finished washing the dishes, her apron still smelling faintly of soap. She spotted Graham sitting on the steps, his eyes fixed far beyond the tree line, lost in thought. Without a word, she walked over and sat beside him. The silence between them didn't feel awkward, it felt necessary. "You've never asked," Clara said quietly, eyes following the fading sky, "why my children and I came knocking on your door that day." Graham didn't turn to look at her. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She nodded, slowly. "Richard?" "My husband. Used to be someone I thought I could trust, but when things got hard, he left. In the middle of winter, no money, no food. He just said, 'You'll figure it out, Clara. You always do.'" Her voice cracked. "But this time, I couldn't. I had to leave. For them." Graham was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, hoarse, almost carried away by the wind. "I understand." Clara turned to him, her gaze questioning. "3 years ago," he began, "I took my wife and daughter on a ski trip to Vermont. Just a short trip, not our first. But that time there was a storm." He swallowed hard. "I made it out. They didn't." Silence returned. Clara didn't try to comfort him. She simply placed a gentle hand on his knee. Graham glanced down, then rested a hand on her shoulder. Not tight, not insistent, just there. A quiet gesture between two people who knew what it meant to lose too much. They sat like that, side by side, watching the sky shift to burnt gold, until Rosie burst through the door with a cheerful shout, "What's for dinner tonight, Mom?" Clara laughed, turning her head. "Probably bean stew and some of that crusty bread, sweetheart." Graham stood and stretched. For the first time, Clara saw him smile. Not polite, not forced, but real, even if just for a second. That night, the cabin glowed in the soft light of lanterns and the warmth of shared voices. Graham wasn't silent like before. He joined in. He nodded at Tommy's rambling questions, and when Rosie told a joke that made no sense at all, he laughed. A deep, genuine sound. The sun rose after a long snowy night, but no one inside the cabin felt any warmer. The pale light stretched across the valley, glinting off frozen patches like a warning. Peace, while real, was always fragile. Clara was sweeping the floor when she heard it. Hoofbeats, not hurried, but steady and certain. She looked up, her heart tightening. Graham had heard them first. He set his coffee mug down and stepped onto the porch, calm as ever, but his eyes were cold, like the frozen lake at dawn. 3 horses emerged from the tree line. Leading them was Richard Moore, wrapped in a thick wool coat, a faint smirk on his lips, as sharp as early frost. Behind him rode 2 unfamiliar men, and one Clara recognized immediately. Sheriff Ellis, clutching a worn piece of paper. "Clara," Richard called out, his voice slicing across the snow-filled clearing. "I'm here like I said. Time to bring the kids home." The cabin door creaked open. Clara stepped outside, Rosie clinging to her skirt. Graham moved to stand between her and Richard, eyes never leaving the man who once walked away from this family. "No need to make this ugly," Richard said, holding out a hand. "I've got court orders. You know what that means, don't you?" Sheriff Ellis unfolded the paper and read aloud, voice flat and distant. "By order of the Cedar County Court, custody of the minor children, Ellie, Rosie, and Tommy, is hereby granted to their biological father, Richard Moore. The mother, Clara Whitmore, is ordered to relinquish them immediately. No one moved. Then Graham spoke, calm but steel-threaded through his voice. The court might not care what he did, but this place does, this town does. As if his words were a signal, figures began emerging from the tree line. Mrs. Fowler from the general store, Pastor Hale, Dr. Jenna, the one who'd treated Tommy's fever weeks ago. They walked quietly but with purpose, coming to stand behind Clara. "We saw her raise those kids day in and day out," Mrs. Fowler said. "We stand with her." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger, but this time he didn't have numbers. He didn't have cold law to hide behind, just a man alone in winter, facing something he couldn't buy. Trust. The air thickened, as if time itself had stopped. All eyes were fixed on Richard. But the silence was broken by Graham. He stepped forward, voice low but steady. "I know your type, Richard. The kind of man who thinks power and paperwork let him walk back in and reclaim what he threw away." Richard gave a dry laugh. "And who are you? Some loner in the woods playing house now?" Graham didn't flinch. "I'm the one who didn't leave. You walked out when they needed you most. I stayed." Richard's face twisted, but he couldn't find words to argue. Then Eli stepped out from the cabin. The boy stood tall, his gaze steady. "Mom raised us when we had nothing. And Mr. Graham? He taught me how to live. He's family." Richard's face twitched with frustration, but before he could respond, the cabin door creaked open. Rosie stepped out, her wool dress brushing her knees, her eyes bright but firm. "Mr. Graham is the one who's always been here," she said, voice trembling slightly but clear. "He taught Eli how to split wood. He made Tommy a whistle. He holds us when it's cold. If we have to call someone Dad, it's him." Eli quietly nodded behind her. Tommy, clutching his stuffed bear, whispered, "I'm not leaving." Richard looked at the children. None of them called him father. None reached for him. They stood in the snow beside the man who had truly become their home. Clara stepped forward, soft but strong. "Family isn't who makes a child. It's who stays, who listens, who loves." Sheriff Ellis hesitated. His gaze swept the gathered townsfolk, and something in his eyes shifted. Richard clenched his fist. "This isn't over." Graham didn't blink. "Maybe not, but today you lost." And for the first time, Richard Moore turned and left, not with arrogance, but with defeat. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind silence and a family that stood steady like pine trees in a snowstorm. After Richard left, the cabin turned quiet, but not from fear this time. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long exhale. Clara hugged the children close. Graham lingered a moment on the porch, eyes fixed on the tree line where Richard had vanished. Then he turned and walked inside, closing the door like closing a chapter of his life. The days that followed passed slowly, yet warmly. Each morning, Eli followed Graham without needing to be asked. He learned how to hammer nails, stack wood neatly, and even sharpen a blade. Graham didn't just teach, he listened. Something Eli wasn't used to from adults. Rosie and Tommy spent their hours by the creek behind the cabin, collecting smooth stones and weaving flower crowns, coming home with muddy boots and glowing faces. One afternoon, Rosie ran inside carrying a gift, a small wooden fox Graham had carved just for her. "I think it's like me," she said. "It's small, but it's fast." Tommy ran through the yard all day with his whistle. The high-pitched sound was more noise than melody, but it made everyone smile. Once, Clara laughed so hard she had to grip the table to stay upright, and the sound made Graham look up, startled, as if he'd just heard music for the first time. In the evenings, after the children had gone to sleep, Clara stood by the hearth, wiping her hands on her apron. Graham sat nearby, sharpening his knife, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. Finally, she sat down across from him, her voice soft. They're really happy here. Graham nodded. They deserve to be. She hesitated. What about you? Are you happy? The blade stopped moving. Graham lifted his eyes. At first, this place was quiet, because I thought quiet meant safe. But then you came, and I realized quiet isn't peace. Sometimes, it's just empty. Clara said nothing. She simply placed her hand palm down on the table, an invitation. Graham looked at her hand, rough but gentle, and laid his over hers, a connection without words, but deeper than any spoken vow. A few weeks later, Clara stood before the Cedar County Courthouse, clutching a folder tight to her chest. Beside her stood Graham, in a simple shirt, his eyes steady as stone. Across from them, Richard came, alone. No lawyer, no smirk. The hearing was brief, but to Clara, each minute felt like carrying a boulder. She spoke calmly, recounting everything: the winter, the abandonment, the long days of keeping her children safe. When Graham was asked to speak, he said only one thing: I watched her do what great mothers do, not for herself, but for her children. When the judge announced the verdict, full custody granted to Clara Whitmore, she didn't cry. She just squeezed Graham's hand as if anchoring herself. Richard walked away quietly. This time, it was truly over. Days later, as the sunset painted the distant mountain ridge in red, Graham led Clara to the edge of the woods, where they had once first spotted the cabin. He didn't say much, just opened his palm. Inside, a wooden ring hand-carved by him. Simple, humble, but every groove carried a promise. I want to do this right, he said, looking her in the eye. Not just the man who stayed, but the man allowed to stand beside you, legally, fully, from my heart. Clara covered her mouth, not from surprise, but from the overwhelming feeling of being put back together, piece by piece. She nodded, smiling through tears. Yes, she whispered. I've wanted that for a long time. That evening, when they returned to the cabin, Rosie was the first to shout at the sight of the ring. So Mr. Graham is going to be our real dad now? Eli smiled quietly. Tommy squealed, Are we going to have cake? Graham laughed, a full, unguarded laugh. Family wasn't just something they hoped for anymore. It was something they had built, one quiet moment at a time. Spring crept quietly into the valley, softening the last traces of snow. New grass sprouted at the cabin steps. Birds returned to the trees. The heavy stillness that once clung to this place had given way to laughter, the scent of warm bread, and the sound of small footsteps on wood floors. The cabin, once a shelter, had become a home. Each morning, Eli rose early to work with Graham, no longer out of duty, but because it felt right. He didn't just learn how to hammer nails, but how to pay attention, to how Graham listened, how he moved with calm intent. Rosie kept talking about the wedding, always ending her questions with giggles. Tommy still played his little whistle, but now its shrill song felt like part of the house itself. One evening, after supper, they sat together by the fire. The flames danced, casting golden light across the room. The scent of pine lingered in the air. Rosie rested her chin on her knees, then spoke. Soft but certain. Mr. Graham, if you marry Mom, can we call you Dad? Tommy nodded immediately. I want to. I've wanted to for a long time. Eli didn't speak right away. Then, with quiet conviction, he added, You didn't just protect us. You became someone we look up to. I want to call you Dad. Graham sat there, holding a tin cup. Firelight flickered in his eyes. He didn't answer right away. He looked at each child. 3 faces. 3 hearts he hadn't brought into the world, but loved as fiercely as if he had. He smiled. Not forced, not hesitant. Yes, he said. From now on, you can call me Dad. Clara turned to him, eyes glistening, but lips curved in joy. Outside it was still spring, but inside the cabin, a warmer season had just begun. One evening, Clara stood on the porch, watching the children laugh and chase each other beneath the golden dusk. Graham stepped beside her, saying nothing, just being there, as if he always had been. "I didn't know if I could ever live again," she whispered. "But now, I know I am. Because of you." Graham turned, placing his hand gently over hers. "Not because of me," he said, "because of us." She tilted her head, resting it softly on his shoulder. The sunset wrapped around them like a quiet witness. Inside, the fireplace glowed warm, filling the home with the scent of bread and pine wood. The children had gone back in, Rosie calling out, "It's getting dark! Come inside, everybody!" Clara and Graham turned together, hand in hand. And for the first time in many winters, no one felt cold. There would still be storms, perhaps, but now they'd face them together.